Her scholarship, her life offers a model for teachers, for educators, for organizers. Public, collaborative, always in process, independent but accountable to communities, and always justice-centered.
Thank you, Bill, for that warm introduction, and thank the North Dakota Study Group for inviting me and our group to this gathering. I've been looking forward to it a great deal because it's taking place at a very special time on the clock of the universe. A very special time in the evolution of the human race, and a very special time in the history of this country when the old American dream is dead and it's up to us to create a new American dream. And we're very fortunate, I think, that at this gathering there are so many generations, that there are old crones like me with 2 hearing aids, a lot of glasses, very different kinds, and very few teeth, but still with most of my marbles. I was born in the middle of the First World War, which for many people is the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Bill and many of you, like Jane, that was a wonderfully informative introduction, Jay, were born after the Second World War. And many of you, like Caitlin and Emma, only came to age in the 21st century. So we're here with the experiences of the 19th century, because many of my professors in college went to school in the age of Darwin, in the middle of the 20th century and going into the 21st. And that's an enormous opportunity and an enormous privilege. And I think that Mike Rose's challenge to us to project an alternative to a system of education that has become a horse race in cognition is the charge that we should bear in mind now and throughout these proceedings and for the rest of our lives. I am very fortunate because I was born on top of my father's Chinese restaurant, female. And I knew what it was like to be a minority, to be an outsider, and to think like an underling. Because in that quotation that Bill just made from Jimmy's speech, Jimmy said, "I don't believe anybody knows more about running this country than me." And when the students in the audience sort of giggled, sort of embarrassed that he would say something like that, he says, "You better think that way. You better stop thinking like a minority. Because when you think like a minority, you think like an underling." And I'm very lucky to have lived so long and become part of the majority. I mean, that's what people of color are becoming. So I had to think a lot about what are the responsibilities of a majority, and that includes all of us now. Responsibilities of a majority are to have a vision, particularly at this time, for building the world anew, and having faith in the power within us to do that, to create the world anew. Because that's what has to be done at this time of economic meltdown, of global warming, of 2 wars in the Middle East, and the kind of inflation that is giving birth to teabaggers, who have to be seen, I believe, as not only the counter-revolution, but as the whip, which Marx says, which makes the revolution move faster. There are a lot of folks among those teabaggers who are responding to big government, to inflation, to lost wars, to the world falling apart, to the American dream becoming a nightmare. And that's where we are. And I'm also very fortunate that in my early 20s, I studied philosophy. And I learned that Descartes and Francis Bacon, who were the philosophers of the Industrial Revolution, who had the linear thinking that made possible the rapid economic growth that now imperils all of us and our planet. And I also studied Hegel, who had the circular thinking that comes out of having experienced the contradictions of the French Revolution. And so I'm going to challenge us to think differently, to know that we are at a stage in the evolution of the human race when how we know, whether we know in the way of Descartes and Francis Bacon, or whether we know with our hearts, with love and compassion, with caring, which method of knowing are we going to embrace? This is a tremendously important philosophical question. Are we going to know with our hearts, or are we going to know only with our brains? With brains as we can see them in the past. I mean, neuroscience in the last period has given us a much more enriched concept of the brain. Are we going to reduce education to a horse race in cognition? Or are we going to really care for our young people? I think, as Jay's excerpts indicated, we have to do. After I got my degree in philosophy, I had the good fortune of living rent-free in a basement in Chicago and experiencing what it's like to have to face down a barricade of rats to get into where you slept. And that brought me into contact with the Black community and the March on Washington movement. And from there, I began working with C.L.R. James, the West Indian Marxist, as Bill pointed out. And from him, I learned what Marx tells us about how capitalism commodifies everything, all our relationships and ourselves. And that is what we have to embrace and hold tight from Marx. And then after I worked with C.L.R. James, I moved to Detroit and married Jimmy Boggs. I already said something, Bill also said something about Jimmy that would give you some sense of who he was. But you know, because he was born and raised in the Deep South, because he then went on to work in an auto plant in Detroit, and worked through the war and began to experience what automation was doing to the workforce. He didn't think of himself so much as a member of a class or as a race, but as part of the evolution of humanity from the agricultural epoch to the industrial epoch, and now to the post-industrial epoch. And I'm suggesting that's how we have to think. We have to think in those long terms. We have to think in terms of how we are now in the midst of a cultural revolution whose ramifications are as profound as those from hunting and gathering 11,000 years ago to agriculture, and then from agriculture to industry a few hundred years ago. That's where we are on the clock of the human race. And we have to have that kind of long-range thinking as we develop practice and policy. It's a new philosophy. It's a new ontology. It's a new philosophy in terms of ways of knowing. And it's a new ontology in the sense that we don't identify ourselves only by our race or our class or our gender. We use what we have from our race or our class or our gender to enrich the whole. We get out of the old boxes. And that's what I think will help us. It's what has helped me over the last 50-some years in Detroit, during which time I've lived mostly in the same house. In the 1980s, it was very easy to be discouraged. It was very easy to give up. In 1985, 365 young people were wounded on the streets of Detroit. 47 were killed. Violence and crime had reached epidemic proportions. The dropout rate had begun. It's now something like 50%. Young people were being sent to prison by the thousands. Over the last 20 years, there must have been, people talk about 2 million people in prison. But think of those who have been there and come out, and who are now part of our community. How do we embrace them, not just with jobs, but with the conviction that, like Malcolm X, the ex-con, they can become transformed and become leaders? That is already happening in Detroit. And that is happening in Detroit because in 1992, we founded Detroit Summer, a multicultural, intergenerational program youth movement that involved young people in what we called rebuilding, redefining, and respiriting the city from the ground up. One of our first volunteers was Julia Pointer-Whitman. She was 16 years old. The coordinator was Shay Howell, who's sitting here. And that created hope in the city of Detroit, that young people assuming responsibility for rebuilding, redefining, and respiriting the city began planting community gardens, began painting public murals, created poetry workshops, invented a back alley bike program for youth transportation. And it was the potential for young people to become creators of the new world, created hope in the city. And veterans of the Detroit Summer Program today are organizers of the Allied Media Conference, which for the last 3 years has been bringing 500 to 1,000 people, young people from all over the country to create their own media and to tell their own stories. That's what young people can become. And that, as I see it, is the new American dream. That is the new kind of more democratic, more participatory, more ecologically conscious, more place-based education that we need in this period to create the new American dream. And that's already been happening in Detroit. And that's why out of the ashes, out of the devastation of deindustrialization in Detroit, has arisen a city of hope. And that's why in June, 15,000 to 20,000 people from all over the country will come to Detroit to believe, to learn that another world is possible and that another world is already happening. I think that therein lies the answer to the question, how do we change education from a horse race in cognition to the beginning of the new American dream?